Okay, ready to get into it?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Today we're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
Big topic, obviously.
Huge.
But we're going to be looking at it through a specific lens today, and that is through the lens of this article we got, A Tale of Two Heathens, which is written from an Orthodox Christian perspective.
Yeah, it's a perspective we don't hear that often, I think, especially in these discussions.
Apparently not.
It kind of throws a wrench on a lot of assumptions that I think a lot of people bring to this.
Yeah, and especially because it kind of starts right from the beginning, taking on like American evangelical Christianity,
Yeah,
which, that's a whole other can of worms.
right.
But so the article starts out by describing this concept of dispensationalism, and it explains how this idea that God has these separate plans for different periods of history leads some people to think that Jewish people, even today, have a special status, even above, like, I don't know what the correct terminology is, but above Gentile Christians, Christians who are not of Jewish origin. So I don't know, maybe you can speak to that a little bit. Like, what is dispensationalism and how does that play into this perspective that we're going to be unpacking?
Yeah, I mean, dispensationalism is, well, it's this whole theological viewpoint that has a huge impact on how, like you said, a lot of American evangelicals in particular view this conflict. Because if you believe that God has this separate plan for, Israel or Jewish people, then the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East takes on a whole different meaning. It's not just about land or politics or history. It's about fulfilling God's plan. And so the article argues that this can lead to this kind of automatic siding with Israel, no matter what. It's like this theological trump card that kind of shuts down any other perspective.
Right. So, like, whatever actions Israel takes are inherently justified by this theological belief.
Yeah, and the article really wants to challenge that. It's not taking sides in terms of like a political solution or anything like that, but it's saying, hold on, we need to look at this from a different perspective, and it's going to make us uncomfortable.
And that perspective is this Orthodox Christian perspective,
Yeah.
which, I mean, you said it's not one we hear a lot. And this article really dives headfirst into it. And one of the things it says is that the early church considered itself the, quote, new Israel, end quote. And it also says that modern Judaism has really strayed from its, what it would consider its Old Testament roots. So how does that very different view of like the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, how does that then color this whole conflict?
Well, it kind of flips the script, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to remember there's a long and often very messy history between Jews and Christians.
Yeah.
And it hasn't always been pretty. So from this perspective, this Orthodox Christian perspective, the idea that there's this natural alliance between them, between Jews and Christians, it's just not there. In fact, you could argue, and the article kind of does, that there's more of a history of conflict. And so that makes modern-day Israel, well, it's not so clear-cut. They're not seen as this automatic ally just because they're Jewish.
It's interesting because, like you said, that's definitely not the narrative you normally hear, at least not here in the States. And an article doesn't just leave it there at, like, the theological arguments, right? It goes on to give some pretty specific examples of what it sees as this conflict playing out in the real world.
Exactly. It gets into the nitty-gritty. And some of it's pretty disturbing, to be honest. Like, it talks about churches being burned in Israel.
Yeah, and then there's that really jarring account of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, broadcasting pornography into Christian areas of Palestine during Easter. I mean, that's just...
It's intense, and it really underscores that there's a real human cost to this conflict. It's not just an intellectual exercise, These are real people, real communities caught in the middle.
And it's really important to point out this isn't just like a one-sided thing where, the article's saying Israel's bad, Palestine's good, or vice versa. It actually, it grapples with both sides of this.
Yeah, it's nuanced, right? Like, it acknowledges that there's this history of, persecution of Christians by Muslims, too.
Yeah.
That's definitely been a thing. But then it also points out, like, there have been times when groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, typically thought of as, I don't know, enemies in this whole thing. They've actually defended Christian communities.
Right.
Like, the article mentions how they fought against ISIS and even, I think, some stuff in Syria where they were protecting Christians. So it's this weird dynamic where for this Orthodox Christian, it's like neither side feels, morally right or like the obvious good guy.
It's like, how do you even choose,
It's a tough spot to be in.
And I think the article uses this really, I don't know, stark analogy to kind of drive that home. It talks about how...
Oh, the hoping both die thing?
Yeah, it's like when a devil is caught by a monster, I, as a human being, can only hope that both die.
Yeah, it's intense.
Which is just like, I feel like it's about as honest as you can get in a way.
Right. Like it really gets at that feeling of being stuck. Like
Yeah.
you're morally repulsed by both sides, and the only way out you can see is if they both just, I don't know, disappear. It's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah, there's not a lot of hope there. But it makes you think, you know? Like,
Yeah.
if you're in that position, if you're looking at this conflict and you're seeing, like you said, flaws on both sides, things that just fundamentally go against your own moral code,
Mhm.
how do you even begin to process that?
And I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, even outside of this specific conflict. You
Yeah.
know, it's that feeling of being caught between a rock and a hard place, where any choice you make feels wrong. It's like a moral lose-lose situation.
It's like, what do you do with that? Like,
Yeah.
how do you even function?
Yeah, and the article doesn't really offer any easy answers, which,
Mhm.
to be fair, I don't think there are any. But it does, I think, force you to confront that feeling,
It
to
does.
sit with the discomfort of it. Because
Right.
that's, I think, the first step to even beginning to understand, the complexities of a situation like this.
Yeah, and maybe to kind of, shift gears a little bit here. The article goes on to talk about the author's views on Jewish influence kind of more broadly. And I think this is where, we have to be really careful.
Yeah, this is where things get a little dicey.
Yeah, because the article reflects some, well, honestly, some pretty concerning viewpoints. And, we've talked about this before, but it's important, I think, to reiterate. Our goal here is to understand and to unpack these arguments, as they're presented, not to endorse them.
Absolutely. We're not saying, hey, this is the right way to think about this. We're saying, this is what this person thinks, and here's why it's important to understand that.
Exactly. We're dissecting a thought process here, not advocating for it. And I think that's especially crucial when we're dealing with something as sensitive, and frankly dangerous as anti-Semitism. This article, it wades into some pretty murky waters, and we have to be very mindful of that.
And I think it's important to remember that words have power. Even if someone says, well, this is just my personal belief, that doesn't erase the historical weight behind those words. And anti-Semitism has a long and ugly history, and it's something we can't ignore or downplay.
Absolutely not. And to be crystal clear, neither of us is endorsing any of that.
Not even a little bit.
But like you said, I do think it's important to try to understand how someone could arrive at these beliefs, even if those beliefs are harmful and dangerous, because that's how we can start to have a more productive conversation, right?
Right. It's about understanding the root of the problem, not just condemning the symptoms.
And I think one of the things that's so striking about the article is that for all of its, harsh language about Jewish people, it then goes on to praise Christian converts from Judaism, even going so far as to suggest that, they should be the ones to, quote, minister to their brothers in Israel, end quote.
It's like this weird cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah, it's very contradictory.
Like, on the one hand, you have this very negative view of Judaism, and then on the other hand, you're saying, well, actually, if you're a Jew who converts to Christianity, then you're great.
Right, which is, that's its own whole other...
It's a can of worms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you reconcile those two things in your head?
And honestly, I don't know if you can. But I think it speaks to the complexity of this whole issue. It's
Yeah.
not as simple as just saying, this is right, this is wrong. There are so many layers to unpack here.
There are. It's like a tangled web, and the more you pull on one thread, the more tangled the whole thing seems to get.
Exactly. And that's why, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I think
Yeah.
it's important to just sit with that discomfort, to acknowledge the complexity,
Yeah.
and to resist the urge to oversimplify.
Yeah, because oversimplification, that's where things get really dangerous. So with all of that said, as we're kind of coming to the end of this deep dive, what do you think are some key takeaways for our listeners? What do you hope they walk away with?
Well, it's tough, right? Because, like I said, I don't think there are easy answers here.
Mm-hmm.
But I do, the fact that we're even having this conversation, the fact that this article exists is kind of the point in itself.
Right.
Like, it's so easy to just stay in our own echo chambers, to surround ourselves with people who already agree with us. And that's especially true when it comes to something as, I don't know, charged as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
But this article, it forces us to do the opposite. It makes us confront a perspective that a lot of us probably haven't really considered before. And even if, especially if we don't agree with everything or even anything, the author says,
Yeah.
I think there's value in that,
Absolutely.
in just sitting with that discomfort and saying, okay, this is a real perspective that a real person holds. How do I make sense of that? How do I even begin to have a conversation with someone who sees the world this way?
Right. And I think it also highlights how much our own backgrounds, whether it's our religious background or cultural background, even just our own personal experiences,
Hmm.
how those all play into how we view these really complex global events.
Yeah, and what might seem black and white to someone else might be a lot more nuanced when you actually get down to it.
It's like that saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, but like applied to our understanding of geopolitics, which is not an easy thing to do.
It's not. It takes effort. It takes empathy.
It does.
And sometimes it means confronting some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah, but I think that's, ultimately
I
it's
think
not
it's worth it,
Yeah,
even if it's just to gain a little bit more understanding.
totally. Well, I don't know about you, but this whole deep dive, it's been, I don't know, it's given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, me too. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, we could probably talk about this for another 3 hours and still not even get to half of it. But, I think the point is, as always, we're not trying to give you all the answers here. We're just trying to spark a conversation to get you thinking about these issues in new and maybe even challenging ways.
And to remind you that there's always more to learn.
Always. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating and thought-provoking exploration.
Until then, keep asking questions.